The haunting whistle of the afternoon train faded into the distance, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust and the sound of a woman's quiet sobs at Concordia Station. Florence Kingston stood alone on the wooden platform, her gloved hands trembling as she clutched a crumpled letter. The Kansas sun beat down mercilessly, illuminating the tear tracks on her pale cheeks as the man who had promised to marry her walked away without so much as a backward glance. Florence had traveled nearly 2,000 miles from Boston to marry a man she'd never met, only to be rejected the moment he laid eyes on her. The sting of humiliation burned worse than the prairie sun as she watched Albert Wilson disappear into the crowd, his parting words still ringing in her ears. "This won't do at all. You're nothing like your photograph." She tried to compose herself, aware of the curious glances from townspeople passing by. Her trunk sat forlorn beside her, monuments to her misplaced hopes. At 22, she was now stranded in a strange town with no prospects, no acquaintances, and rapidly diminishing funds. "Madam, are you all right?" The deep voice startled Florence, and she hurriedly wiped her tears, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable state. She looked up to see a tall man standing before her, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. His clothes were dusty from the trail, marking him clearly as a working cowboy. "I'm quite fine, thank you," Florence replied automatically, her Boston upbringing forcing politeness despite her distress. The man tilted his hat back, revealing kind blue eyes that crinkled slightly at the corners. "Beggin' your pardon, but you don't look fine, and those trunks look mighty heavy for a lady alone." Florence bit her lip, struggling to maintain her composure. I seem to find myself in an unexpected predicament." "Name's Killian Forrester," he said, removing his hat completely now. "I run the Double F Ranch about 10 miles outside of town." His auburn hair was sun-bleached at the edges, and when he smiled, Florence noticed a small scar at the corner of his mouth. "Florence Kingston," she replied, offering a slight curtsy out of habit. "I've come from Boston too." The words caught in her throat. How could she admit she'd been rejected as a mail-order bride? The humiliation was too great. Killian's eyes moved to the crumpled letter in her hand, then to her abandoned trunks, and understanding dawned on his weathered face. "Wilson," he said flatly. "Albert Wilson." Florence's eyes widened. "You know him?" "Know of him," Killian corrected, his jaw tightening. "He's done this before, sends for brides, then finds some excuse when they arrive." He shook his head, disgust evident in his expression. "Man's got a reputation for collecting the train fare he demands up front. Never actually intends to marry." Fresh tears welled in Florence's eyes at this revelation. Not only rejected, but swindled as well. She'd spent nearly all her savings on the train fare and the trousseau she'd carefully packed in her trunks. "I'm afraid I've been terribly foolish," she whispered. Killian's expression softened. "No, madam, just trusting. There's a difference." He glanced at the westering sun. "You got a place to stay tonight?" Florence shook her head, despair washing over her anew. "Well then," Killian said, clearing his throat. He extended his hand toward her, calloused and sun-darkened against her pale skin. "I'd like to offer you a proposition, Miss Kingston." Florence stared at his outstretched hand, wariness creeping into her expression. "Nothing improper," he added hastily. "My sister runs a boarding house in town. She's always looking for help. I can take you there, see if she can offer you work and a place to stay until you figure things out." The kindness in his offer nearly undid her completely. "Why would you help me?" Florence asked, her voice barely audible above the bustle of the station. Killian's smile was warm and genuine. "Because nobody deserves to be left crying at a train station. Especially not someone brave enough to travel halfway across the country on nothing but a promise." Florence hesitated only a moment before placing her gloved hand in his. "Thank you, Mr. Forrester." "Killian," he corrected, signaling to a young boy lounging nearby. "Jimmy, bring the ladies' trunks to my wagon." He reached into his pocket, flipping the boy a coin. "And let's make it quick. We've got a ways to go before sundown." As Killian helped Florence into his wagon, she couldn't help but notice how different he was from the refined Boston gentleman she'd known, and how different from Albert Wilson, who had described himself as a prosperous businessman in his letters. Killian was honest in his roughness, with no pretense or false airs. "It's not much," he said as they pulled away from the station, "but Concordia's a decent town. Good people for the most part." He glanced at her sideways. "Not all men out here are like Wilson." As the wagon rattled down the main street, Florence took in the frontier town that might now become her home. A far cry from Boston's cobblestone streets and brick houses, Concordia consisted mainly of wooden structures lining a wide dirt thoroughfare. Men in dusty clothes and women in practical dresses moved about their business, occasionally tipping a hat or nodding in Killian's direction. "You must be well known here," Florence observed. Killian chuckled. "Been here since '65, right after the war. Started with nothing but a broken-down mule and 50 acres. Now the Double F runs almost 2,000 head of cattle." There was quiet pride in his voice, not boastful but earned. "That's quite impressive," Florence said sincerely. "It's work," he replied simply. "Hard work, but honest." He turned the wagon down a side street lined with more modest homes. "My sister Sarah lost her husband at Gettysburg. Came out here to start fresh. The boarding house has been good for her, keeps her busy, gives her purpose." They pulled up in front of a 2-story white clapboard house with green shutters and a wide porch. Flower boxes filled with brightly colored blooms adorned each window, a cheerful touch that immediately put Florence more at ease. "Sarah," Killian called as he helped Florence down from the wagon. "Got a visitor for you." The door opened, and a woman with the same auburn hair as Killian emerged, wiping her hands on an apron. Her face was lined but friendly, her eyes holding the same kindness as her brother's. "Killian Forrester, I wasn't expecting you until Saturday," she said before her gaze fell on Florence. "And who might this be?" "This is Miss Florence Kingston," Killian explained, removing his hat. "She's had some trouble and needs a place to stay." Sarah's eyes took in Florence's fine clothes, her tear-stained face, and the trunks in the wagon. Understanding passed between the siblings without words. "Wilson?" she asked softly. Killian nodded. Sarah's expression darkened momentarily before she stepped forward with an outstretched hand. "Well, you're welcome here, Miss Kingston. I've got a room that just emptied yesterday, and I could use another pair of hands around the place if you're willing." Relief flooded through Florence. "I would be most grateful, Mrs. Hoffman, but call me Sarah," she said warmly. "Everyone does." As Jimmy helped carry Florence's trunks inside, Sarah showed her to a small but clean room on the second floor. "It's not fancy, but it's comfortable," she explained. "Bathrooms down the hall. Meals are at 7, noon, and 6. We've got 6 other boarders at present, all men, I'm afraid, mostly clerks from the bank and mercantile. Decent sorts." Florence looked around the simple room with its iron bed, washstand, and small dresser. A braided rug covered part of the wooden floor, and lace curtains hung at the window overlooking the street. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it despite its stark contrast to her family home in Boston. "Rest a bit," Sarah suggested. "Dinner's in an hour. We can talk then about what kind of work might suit you." After Sarah left, Florence sank onto the bed, the events of the day finally catching up with her. The room might be humble, but it offered something she desperately needed: sanctuary. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. It was Killian, hat in hand, looking somewhat uncomfortable in the narrow hallway. "I'll be heading back to the ranch now," he said. "Just wanted to make sure you were settling in all right." "Thanks to your kindness," Florence replied. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Killian shook his head. "No need for that. Sarah can always use the help and—" He hesitated. "Well, Concordia could use more good people, too many just passing through." There was a question in his statement, one Florence wasn't ready to answer. Would she stay? Could she make a life here? Everything she'd known was back east. "I'll be in town again on Saturday," Killian continued, "bringing beef to the hotel and supplies back to the ranch. If you need anything before then, Sarah knows how to reach me." "Thank you, Mr. Forrester, truly." "Killian," he reminded her with a smile that transformed his weathered face. "Good evening, Miss Kingston." As he turned to leave, Florence found herself calling after him. "Florence, please call me Florence." His smile widened. "Florence," he repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "Until Saturday, then." After he departed, Florence began unpacking her trunks, carefully hanging her dresses in the small wardrobe. Among them was a wedding dress she'd sewn herself, every stitch filled with dreams and expectations. She ran her fingers over the delicate fabric, wondering if it would ever serve its intended purpose now. Dinner that evening was a simple but hearty affair: roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie. The other boarders were indeed polite, if curious about their new housemate. Mr. Jenkins from the bank, Mr. Cooper and Mr. Davis from the mercantile, Dr. Larson, the town's younger physician, and two brothers named Parker who worked for the railroad. They asked few questions, seemingly taking their cue from Sarah's protective manner. After the men had retired to the parlor for pipes and conversation, Sarah sat with Florence in the kitchen as they washed dishes. "Killian told me what happened," she said gently. "I'm sorry you were treated so shamefully." Florence concentrated on drying a plate. "I was naive. My parents died last year, leaving considerable debts. The family home had to be sold. I had few options. And Wilson's letters promised security," Sarah finished for her. "I understand better than you might think. William, my late husband, and I corresponded for nearly a year before we wed. I came from Philadelphia to Kansas knowing him only through his words." Her eyes grew distant. "We had 3 good years before Gettysburg." "I'm sorry," Florence said softly. Sarah smiled sadly. "Life takes unexpected turns. What matters is how we face them." She put down her dishcloth. "Now about your position here. Can you cook?" Florence hesitated. "Basic things. I had little opportunity in Boston. We had a cook." "Can you keep accounts, read, write?" "Yes, quite well. I was educated at Miss Porter's school in Connecticut." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Well now, that's something indeed. I've been wanting to organize my ledgers properly, and the correspondence I get inquiries about rooms nearly every week." She studied Florence thoughtfully. "I can offer room and board plus $2 a week." "It's not much, but it's more than generous," Florence interrupted. "I'd be delighted to accept." Later, lying in her narrow bed, Florence stared at the unfamiliar ceiling. 24 hours ago, she'd been on a train, filled with anxiety and hope about meeting her future husband. Now she was alone in a strange town, employed as a housekeeper of sorts. Not the life she'd imagined, but she was safe, with a roof over her head and honest work, and the memory of kind blue eyes and an outstretched hand. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze that offered respite from the late August heat. Florence had settled quickly into life at the boarding house, finding unexpected satisfaction in helping Sarah with the accounts and correspondence. Her elegant handwriting and proper grammar had already improved the professional appearance of Sarah's business letters. She was sweeping the front porch when Killian's wagon appeared. He wasn't alone. A young boy of perhaps 12 sat beside him, gangly and freckle-faced. "Morning, Florence," Killian called, tipping his hat. "This here's my nephew, Thomas. Thought he might like to see his ma while I'm in town." The boy jumped down almost before the wagon stopped, racing up the steps past Florence. "Is Ma making apple dumplings?" he asked, barely slowing. Florence laughed. "I believe she is." "Thomas Hoffman, where are your manners?" Killian called after him. "Sorry about that. Boy's got one thing on his mind when he visits town." "His mother's cooking," Florence finished with a smile. "A worthy priority." Killian seemed to study her for a moment. "You look well, more settled." "I feel more settled," she admitted. "Your sister has been extraordinarily kind." "Sarah's got a good heart," he agreed, securing the horses. "I'll be a while in town, got deliveries and supplies to gather, thought maybe." He hesitated, appearing almost boyishly uncertain. "Thought maybe you might like to join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant, to celebrate your first week in Concordia." The invitation surprised Florence, though not unpleasantly. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to impose on your time in town." "No imposition," he assured her quickly. "Been thinking about it all week, truth be told." The simple honesty of his admission touched Florence deeply. In Boston, courtship was a carefully orchestrated dance of subtle signals and proper chaperoning. Here was this man, straightforward and genuine without pretense. "I'd be delighted," she said. His smile was immediate and warming. "I'll come by around 6 then." As he walked back to his wagon, Florence found herself watching the easy confidence of his stride, the broad shoulders that spoke of physical labor rather than tailored suits. He was nothing like the men she'd known in Boston, and nothing like she'd imagined when corresponding with Albert Wilson. "He likes you," came Sarah's voice from the doorway. Florence turned, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "He's simply being kind." Sarah shook her head, a knowing smile playing at her lips. "My brother doesn't invite women to dinner at the hotel, not ever." "Oh," Florence said, unsure how to respond. "It's good," Sarah continued. "Killian spent too many years alone on that ranch, works from sunrise to sunset, builds something solid but has no one to share it with." She sighed. "After Rebecca died." "Rebecca," Florence echoed, "his wife." 15 years ago now, childbirth took her and the baby both. Sarah's eyes clouded with the memory. "Nearly destroyed him. Threw himself into building the ranch, raising cattle, as if working hard enough might keep the grief at bay." Florence felt a pang of sympathy. "I had no idea." "He doesn't speak of it," Sarah said, "but it's why he stepped in when he saw you crying at the station. Killian can't abide seeing someone in pain." She touched Florence's arm gently. "Just so you know where things stand." The afternoon passed in a flurry of activity, as Florence helped prepare Saturday dinner for the boarders. When she finally went upstairs to dress for her evening with Killian, she found herself uncharacteristically nervous. She selected a dress of deep blue silk, not her finest, which would have been too formal but pretty enough for a dinner in town. Sarah helped with her hair, twisting it into a simple but elegant style. "You look lovely," she said when they finished. "Blue suits you. You think it's too much?" Florence worried, smoothing the fabric. "I don't want to appear as if I'm trying too hard." Sarah finished with a smile. "No, you look appropriate for dinner at the best restaurant in town with one of Concordia's most respected ranchers." When Killian arrived, promptly at 6, Florence almost didn't recognize him. Gone were the dusty work clothes, replaced by a clean black suit, white shirt and string tie. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. He held his hat in his hands, looking almost as nervous as she felt. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "As do you," Florence replied, then blushed at her forwardness. That is, you look very handsome." Sarah watched this exchange with poorly concealed amusement. "Have her back by 10, Killian. This isn't the wild frontier anymore." "Yes, madam," he said with mock seriousness, offering Florence his arm. "Shall we?" The Grand Hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Concordia, which wasn't saying much compared to Boston's standards, but Florence found its simple elegance charming. White tablecloths, polished silverware, and small vases of wildflowers adorned each table. A piano played softly in the corner. "This is lovely," she said as the waiter seated them. "Best food in 3 counties," Killian replied. "Though don't tell Sarah I said so." Their conversation flowed easily through dinner. Florence told him about growing up in Boston, her education, and the financial troubles after her parents' deaths. Killian spoke of building his ranch from nearly nothing, the challenges of cattle drives, and his dreams of expanding further west. "I've got my eye on a piece of land that borders mine," he explained over coffee and apple pie. "Would give me access to more water, better grazing, owners thinking of selling." "It sounds like a sound investment," Florence said. Killian looked pleased at her understanding. "Most ladies I know don't take much interest in ranch business. Most ladies you know probably didn't have a father who discussed business at the dinner table every night," she replied with a smile. "Papa believed I should understand financial matters, even if society deemed it unladylike." "Smart man, your father." As they walked back to the boarding house in the cool evening air, Florence found herself unusually comfortable with this man she'd known less than a week. There was something solid about Killian Forrester, dependable in a way she hadn't encountered before. "Thank you for a lovely evening," she said when they reached Sarah's porch. "My pleasure," he replied. "I'd like to do it again. Maybe next Saturday," Florence nodded, smiling. "I'd like that very much." Killian hesitated, then gently took her hand. His touch was warm, his fingers calloused from years of hard work. "I'm glad Wilson was a fool," he said quietly. "His loss is Concordia's gain." Before Florence could respond, he bowed slightly, released her hand, and stepped back. "Good night, Florence." "Good night, Killian." Inside, Sarah was waiting in the parlor, pretending to mend a tablecloth. "Well?" she asked, not looking up from her needlework. "It was a lovely dinner," Florence said simply, but couldn't hide her smile. "MMHMM," Sarah hummed knowingly. "I haven't seen my brother in a suit since Judge Parker's daughter got married 3 years ago." The weeks that followed settled into a pleasant rhythm. Florence's days were filled with work at the boarding house, keeping accounts, writing correspondence, helping with meals and cleaning. She discovered an unexpected aptitude for managing the business side of Sarah's establishment, implementing systems that improved efficiency and increased profits. Every Saturday, Killian would come to town for supplies, and every Saturday evening, he would take Florence to dinner. Sometimes at the hotel, sometimes at the smaller cafe by the Mercantile. Occasionally, when the weather permitted, they would have a picnic by the creek just outside of town, Thomas accompanying them like a cheerful chaperone. September gave way to October, bringing cooler temperatures and the rich colors of autumn to the Kansas plains. Florence found herself increasingly comfortable in Concordia, making acquaintances that gradually deepened into friendships. Mrs. Henderson at the millinery shop invited her to join the Ladies' Aid Society. Mr. Jenkins at the bank sought her opinion on a new filing system. Even Dr. Larson occasionally asked her to help write letters to medical suppliers, impressed by her penmanship and composition. One Saturday in mid-October, Killian arrived later than usual, his expression troubled. "Sorry I'm late," he said when Florence met him on the porch. "Had some trouble at the ranch." "Nothing serious, I hope," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Found some fences cut on the north boundary. Lost about 20 head of cattle." Rustlers? Florence asked, having learned enough about ranch life to understand the implication. Killian nodded grimly. Been happening all through the county. Sheriffs formed a posse, but they haven't caught anyone yet. He forced a smile. But that's not your concern. Ready for dinner. Throughout their meal, Florence could sense his distraction. You're worried about the ranch, she observed as they walked back to Sarah's in the crisp evening air. Can't help it, he admitted. Everything I've built could disappear if these rustlers keep at it, and with winter coming. Florence stopped walking, turning to face him. Then go back tonight. Don't wait until tomorrow. Killian looked surprised. But I always stay in town Saturday nights. Thomas visits with Sarah and I. He paused, his eyes holding hers. I get to see you. Thomas can stay with Sarah as planned, Florence said practically. And you and I will see each other next Saturday. He studied her face in the moonlight. Most ladies would be upset at having their evening cut short. I'm not most ladies, Florence replied with a small smile. And your ranch matters. It's your life's work. Something shifted in Killian's expression, a deepening, a recognition. Without warning, he took her hands in his. Florence Kingston, you are the most remarkable woman I've ever known. Before she could respond, he leaned forward and kissed her gently, briefly, but with unmistakable intent. When he pulled away, his eyes searched hers for a reaction. Florence felt warmth spreading through her despite the cool night. That was unexpected, but not unwelcome, he asked, a trace of uncertainty in his voice. No, she whispered. Not unwelcome at all. His relieved smile was answer enough. I should still see you home properly. As they continued walking, his hand found hers, fingers intertwining naturally. When they reached the boarding house, he kissed her again, more confidently this time. Be careful at the ranch, she said as they parted. Those rustlers sound dangerous. I will, he promised. And Florence. Thank you for understanding. After he left, Florence sat on the porch swing, replaying the evening in her mind. 2 months ago, she'd arrived in Concordia heartbroken and humiliated, her future uncertain. Now she found herself falling for a man so different from anyone she'd imagined, yet somehow exactly right. Sarah found her there, still smiling to herself. I take it my brother finally found his courage, she observed, sitting beside Florence. He kissed me, Florence admitted, feeling girlishly giddy. About time, Sarah replied with a laugh. He's been sweet on you since the day he found you at that station. The following week brought the first real cold snap of the season. Florence was busy helping Sarah prepare the boarding house for winter, hanging heavier curtains, checking for drafts, storing preserves in the cellar. By Friday, she found herself watching the road whenever she was near a window, hoping for a glimpse of Killian's wagon. He'll be here tomorrow, Sarah assured her, catching Florence peeking out the kitchen window yet again. But Saturday morning arrived with heavy, threatening skies and no sign of Killian. By noon, a freezing rain had begun to fall, coating everything in a slick layer of ice. He won't come in this weather, Sarah said, trying to mask her own concern. The creek ford would be too dangerous. By evening, Florence's worry had deepened. Could something have happened? The rustlers. Sarah squeezed her hand reassuringly. Killian's lived through worse than an ice storm. He's probably sitting by his fire, cursing the weather for keeping him from seeing you. But when Sunday passed with no word, even Sarah grew concerned. If it clears by morning, I'll send Thomas to the Murray farm. They're closest to Killian's place, might have news. Monday dawned clear and cold. Thomas set off early, promising to return by afternoon. Florence found herself unable to concentrate on her usual tasks, jumping at every sound that might be a visitor. It was nearly dusk when Thomas finally returned, accompanied by a stranger, a weathered man in his 40s who introduced himself as Hank Murray. Miss Kingston. "Mrs. Hoffman, I'm afraid I've got news about Killian," he said, removing his hat as he entered the parlor. Florence felt her heart drop. "Is he hurt?" "Shot," Murray said grimly. "Caught some rustlers on his property Friday night. There was a fight. Killian took a bullet to the shoulder, another grazed his head. He's alive but fevered. My wife's tending him, but—" He hesitated, looking uncomfortable. "But what, Mr. Murray?" Sarah pressed. "He's asking for Florence. In his fever, keeps calling her name." Mrs. Murray thought, if it wouldn't be too improper, perhaps Miss Kingston might come. Sometimes seeing a familiar face can make the difference when a man's fighting to live. Florence was already on her feet. "I'll get my coat." Sarah looked torn between propriety and concern for her brother. "Florence, it wouldn't be appropriate for you to stay at a stranger's home, especially with Killian in such a state." "I'll go too," she decided. "Mrs. Carson can watch the boarders for a day or two." She turned to Murray. "How far is your farm?" "About 8 miles. We can make it before full dark if we leave now." Within half an hour, Florence and Sarah were in Murray's wagon, bundled against the cold. Florence clutched her small medical kit, a gift from her father years ago, containing basic remedies and bandaging supplies. "Killian's strong," Sarah said, noticing Florence's tense posture. "He survived worse." "Has he?" Florence asked softly. "After Rebecca died, he caught pneumonia. Refused to eat, wouldn't let anyone help him. We thought we'd lose him then." Sarah's voice dropped. "But he fought his way back. He'll fight now." The Murray farm was a modest homestead about 2 miles from Killian's ranch. Mrs. Murray, a kind-faced woman in her 40s, greeted them at the door. "He's sleeping now," she explained, leading them inside. "The doctor from Belleville came yesterday, removed the bullet, cleaned the wounds. Said if infection doesn't set in, he should recover, but the fever's still high." She led them to a small bedroom off the main living area. Florence's breath caught at the sight of Killian, normally so vital and strong, lying pale and still beneath heavy quilts. A bandage wrapped around his head and another covered his left shoulder. "Killian," Sarah whispered, moving to her brother's side. She touched his forehead gently. "He's burning up." Florence approached the bed, her heart pounding. "May I?" she asked Mrs. Murray, indicating her medical kit. "Of course, dear. I've been using cold compresses, but they don't seem to be helping much." Florence opened her kit, removing a small bottle. "Willow bark tincture," she explained. "It can help reduce fever, and I have some herbs for a poultice that might draw infection from the wound." "You know about medicines?" Mrs. Murray asked, surprised. "My father was a doctor," Florence explained. "He insisted I learn basic treatments, said a woman should know how to care for her family in times of illness." With Mrs. Murray's help, Florence prepared the willow bark tea, carefully supporting Killian's head as she helped him drink it in his semi-conscious state. Then she mixed the herbal poultice and gently applied it to his shoulder wound after checking for signs of infection. "We should change this every few hours," she instructed Mrs. Murray, "and keep giving him the tea whenever he's conscious enough to swallow." Sarah watched Florence work with newfound respect. "You never mentioned you had medical knowledge." "It never seemed relevant until now," Florence replied, gently wiping Killian's fevered brow with a cool cloth. "Papa believed women should be educated in practical matters, not just social graces." Throughout the night, Florence and Mrs. Murray took turns sitting with Killian. During her watch, Florence would talk to him softly, hoping her voice might reach through the fever. She told him about Boston, about her childhood, about her first impressions of Concordia. Sometimes his eyes would flutter, and he would murmur her name before slipping back into restless sleep. Near dawn, Florence was dozing in the chair beside his bed when she felt a touch on her hand. She opened her eyes to find Killian watching her, his gaze clearer than it had been since their arrival. "Florence," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse. "You're really here? I thought I was dreaming." Joy surged through her. "I'm here," she confirmed, taking his hand in hers. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by the entire herd," he admitted with a weak attempt at a smile. "But better for seeing you." Florence pressed the back of her hand to his forehead. "Your fever's broken. Thank God." He struggled to sit up slightly, wincing at the pain in his shoulder. "The rustlers, don't worry about that now," she soothed. "Sheriff caught 2 of them after they shot you. The others ran off." "My cattle are fine," she assured him. "Mr. Murray and some neighbors have been checking on your ranch. Everything's under control." Killian relaxed slightly, his eyes never leaving her face. "You shouldn't be here. It's not proper." Florence laughed softly. "Sarah's here too, so my reputation remains intact, though I'd have come anyway." His hand tightened around hers. "I was riding to town to see you when I spotted them cutting my fence. Didn't even think, just confronted them." He shook his head slightly, immediately regretting the movement. "Foolish." "Brave," Florence corrected, "and perhaps a bit foolish, but that's who you are." A smile touched his lips. "How long have you been here?" "Since yesterday evening." "You've been fevered for nearly 3 days." Concern crossed his features. "You haven't been sleeping." "Enough," she said dismissively. "Mrs. Murray and I have been taking turns." Killian's expression grew serious. "Florence, seeing you here caring for me, it's made something very clear to me." Her heart quickened. "What's that?" "I love you," he said simply. "Probably have since that day at the station." "I know it's too soon, probably too forward, but nearly dying makes a man reconsider what's important to say and when to say it." Florence felt tears spring to her eyes. "It's not too soon," she whispered. "Not when I feel the same way." His eyes widened. "You do." "I do," she confirmed. "I love you, Killian Forrester. Coming to Concordia was the best mistake I ever made." The next few days saw steady improvement in Killian's condition. By the end of the week, he was strong enough to be moved back to his own ranch, with Florence, Sarah, and the Murrays accompanying him. Florence gasped when she first saw the Double F Ranch, a sprawling property with a large 2-story house, several outbuildings, and corrals filled with cattle. It was far more impressive than she had imagined from Killian's modest descriptions. "This is beautiful," she exclaimed as they approached. "Built most of it myself," Killian said from where he sat propped up in the wagon. "Added on over the years." Inside, the house was surprisingly comfortable, if a bit sparse in decoration. Large windows let in ample light, illuminating solid furniture and clean, open spaces. A Mexican woman named Alina, who cooked and kept house for Killian, greeted them warmly, exclaiming over her employer's condition in a mix of English and Spanish. "Alina's been with me for 10 years, Killian explained as she fussed around him, helping him to his bedroom. "Don't know what I'd do without her." Over the next 2 weeks, Florence divided her time between the boarding house and the ranch, riding out with Thomas or Mr. Murray to check on Killian and help with his recovery. Sarah had initially expressed concern about these visits, but the seriousness of Killian's condition and the presence of Alina as chaperone eased her worries about propriety. By early November, Killian was able to move around the house with only occasional discomfort. One crisp afternoon, he suggested a short walk to show Florence more of the ranch. "Doctor says I need to build my strength," he explained, offering her his good arm as they strolled toward a small rise overlooking the property. From this vantage point, the Double F spread out before them pastures, creek, barns, and corrals. In the distance, a herd of cattle grazed peacefully. "It's even more impressive from up here," Florence said, admiring the view. "It's a good life," Killian agreed. "Hard sometimes, but good." He turned to face her, his expression serious. Florence, these past weeks, having you here, it's made me realize something. What's that? She asked, though her heart seemed to know the answer already. This place needs a woman's touch. I built it thinking someday it would be a proper home, not just a house where a rancher sleeps. He took both her hands in his. I know it's not Boston. I know it's not the life you were raised for, but I love you, Florence Kingston. Would you consider staying? Not just in Concordia, but here. With me, as my wife. Joy bubbled up inside her, so intense it almost hurt. Are you proposing, Mr. Forrester? She asked, her voice teasing despite the tears gathering in her eyes. I believe I am, Miss Kingston, he replied, a smile breaking across his face. Rather clumsily but sincerely. Then yes, she said simply. Yes, I will marry you. Killian pulled her gently into his arms, mindful of his healing shoulder. His kiss was tender, full of promise and shared dreams. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. I don't have a ring yet, he admitted. But there's one in my mother's things. Sarah's been keeping it for me. It's not fancy. I don't need fancy, Florence interrupted. I just need you. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Concordia. Sarah was ecstatic, throwing her arms around Florence when they told her. I've been praying for this since the day he brought you to my door, she confessed. The boarders offered hearty congratulations, as did the various townspeople who had come to know and respect Florence during her time there. Even Mr. Jenkins at the bank seemed pleased, though he expressed disappointment at losing his most efficient correspondent. Only one person received the news with less than enthusiasm. Florence was shopping at the Mercantile when Albert Wilson approached her, his expression contrite. Miss Kingston, he said, removing his hat. I hear congratulations are in order. Florence regarded him coolly. Mr. Wilson, yes, I'm engaged to Mr. Forrester, I see. He shifted uncomfortably. I wanted to apologize for my behavior when you arrived. It was ungentlemanly. It was fraudulent, Florence corrected, keeping her voice low but firm. You never intended to marry me or any other woman who answered your advertisement. You merely wanted the train fare. Wilson had the grace to look ashamed. That's not entirely true. I did want to marry, but you found me lacking, Florence finished for him. As it happens, Mr. Wilson, your rejection was the greatest favor anyone has ever done for me, so I thank you for it. With that, she turned and walked away, head held high. Later, when she recounted the encounter to Killian, he laughed. That's my Florence. Too much character to hold a grudge, too much spirit to let him think he's forgiven. The wedding was set for December 15th, a date chosen to allow time for preparations, but not so distant that they must endure a long engagement. Sarah threw herself into the planning with enthusiasm, while Florence found herself unexpectedly emotional about creating a new home and family. I never thought I'd marry for love, she admitted to Sarah one evening as they reviewed fabric swatches for new curtains at the ranch house. When I answered Albert's advertisement, I was being practical, looking for security, not romance. And now, Sarah prompted with a knowing smile. Now I can't imagine marrying for any other reason, Florence replied, her eyes soft with the thought of Killian. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, with a light dusting of snow that transformed Concordia into a winter wonderland. The small church was decorated with evergreen boughs and red berries, filling the air with a fresh, piney scent. Florence wore her white silk dress, the one she'd sewn for her wedding to Albert Wilson, now altered slightly and adorned with lace borrowed from Sarah. As she prepared in a small room off the church sanctuary, there was a gentle knock at the door. "Who is it?" she called, expecting Sarah or perhaps Mrs. Henderson. "It's Killian," came the reply. "I know it's bad luck to see the bride, but could you open the door just a crack?" "I need to tell you something." Curious, Florence opened the door slightly, careful to stay mostly hidden behind it. "What is it? Is everything all right?" Killian's voice was earnest. "Everything's perfect, I just—" He paused, and she could hear the emotion in his words. "I just wanted to tell you that the day you arrived at that station was the luckiest day of my life. And I thank God every night that Wilson was fool enough to walk away from the most beautiful, intelligent, courageous woman I've ever known." Tears threatened to ruin Florence's carefully applied rouge. "Killian Forrester, if you make me cry before the ceremony, I'll never forgive you." His chuckle was warm and familiar. "Save your tears for the vows, then. I'll see you at the altar." The ceremony itself was simple but deeply moving. Florence walked down the aisle alone, her eyes fixed on Killian's tall figure waiting for her. He looked handsome in his new suit, his shoulder now fully healed, his face alight with joy as he watched her approach. Reverend Thompson spoke of commitment, partnership, and God's blessings on their union. When it came time for the vows, Killian's voice rang clear and confident through the church. "I, Killian James Forrester, take you, Florence Eliza Kingston, to be my lawfully wedded wife. To have and to hold, from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Florence's voice trembled slightly as she repeated the words, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought her to this moment. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Killian's kiss was both tender and possessive, a promise of the life they would build together. The reception was held at the Grand Hotel, where Florence and Killian had shared their first dinner. The entire town seemed to have turned out to celebrate, filling the dining room with laughter and good wishes. Even Alina had come from the ranch, bringing a special cake decorated with sugared flowers. As the evening drew to a close, Killian led Florence to the waiting carriage that would take them back to the Double F. "Ready to see your new home, Mrs. Forrester?" he asked, helping her inside. "I've seen it before," she reminded him with a smile. "Not as its mistress," he replied, settling beside her and pulling a thick blanket over their laps against the December chill. "Not as my wife." The journey to the ranch was peaceful, the moonlight casting a silver glow over the snow-covered landscape. Florence leaned against Killian's shoulder, content in a way she'd never imagined possible when she'd first stepped off that train months ago. At the ranch, Killian surprised her by sweeping her into his arms as they reached the front door. "Tradition," he explained with a grin, carrying her across the threshold despite her laughing protests about his recently healed shoulder. Inside, the house was warm and welcoming. Alina had prepared it beautifully, with a fire burning in the hearth and fresh flowers on the table despite the winter season. Candles lit the way up the stairs to the master bedroom, where more flowers and a bottle of champagne awaited. "When did you arrange all this?" Florence asked, touched by the thoughtful details. "I had help," Killian admitted. "Sarah, Alina, and half the ladies in town, I think. They wanted everything to be perfect for you." "It is perfect," she whispered, turning into his embrace, "because I'm with you." Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Florence traced the scar on Killian's shoulder, a permanent reminder of how close she had come to losing him before their life together had truly begun. "What are you thinking?" he asked, catching her hand and bringing it to his lips. "I'm thinking about that day at the station," she replied honestly. "How devastated I was, how I thought my life was over before it had really begun. And now," she smiled in the darkness, "now I know it was just beginning. The real story was waiting to unfold." Spring came early to Kansas that year, bringing with it new life and renewed hope. The Double F Ranch thrived under its new mistress's care. Florence had transformed the house with small touches: curtains, rugs, flowers, and books, making it truly a home. She had also revealed an unexpected aptitude for ranch finances, organizing Killian's haphazard accounts into proper ledgers that showed, for the first time, exactly how profitable the operation was. "You should have been a banker," Killian teased one evening as she explained her latest system for tracking cattle sales. "I'm exactly what I should be," she replied contentedly. "A rancher's wife." By late April, Florence had news that brought even greater joy to their home. She waited until after dinner one evening when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset to share it with Killian. "I visited Dr. Larson today," she began casually. Killian looked concerned immediately. "Are you ill? Why didn't you tell me?" "Not ill," she assured him, taking his hand and placing it gently on her still flat stomach. "Expecting." His expression transformed from worry to wonder in an instant. "A baby, our baby," Florence nodded, laughing at his stunned joy. "Due in November, Dr. Larson thinks." Killian pulled her into his arms, his embrace gentle as if she might break. "Florence," he whispered against her hair, "I didn't think I could be happier than the day you agreed to be my wife. But this—" "I know," she said, understanding the emotion that made his voice rough. After losing his first wife and child, this news carried special significance. "We're going to be a family, Killian." The months that followed were busy ones at the Double F. Killian insisted on building an addition to the house, 2 new bedrooms and a proper nursery. He also hired extra hands for the ranch work, determined that Florence should not overexert herself despite her protests that pregnancy wasn't an illness. Sarah visited often, bringing baby clothes she'd sewn and endless advice about childbirth and infant care. The ladies of Concordia organized a baby shower, presenting Florence with handmade gifts and practical items for the coming child. By October, Florence's condition was obvious, her normally slender frame now gracefully rounded with child. Killian had grown increasingly protective, barely allowing her to lift so much as a teacup without assistance. "You're going to drive me mad," she informed him one afternoon as he insisted on helping her from her chair. "I'm pregnant, not invalid." "Humor me," he replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I just want you both safe." As her time drew closer, Elena moved into the house temporarily to help, and Sarah arranged to stay for the birth and the weeks following. Dr. Larson promised to come as soon as he was summoned, though he warned that November could bring unpredictable weather. True to form, when Florence's labor began on November 12th, a bitter cold front had moved in, bringing freezing rain that threatened to make the roads impassable. Killian paced anxiously while Thomas rode for the doctor, returning 2 hours later with the news that Dr. Larson was delivering twins at a farm 10 miles in the opposite direction. "The baby's not waiting for him," Sarah announced after checking Florence. "This child is coming now." Florence's labor progressed rapidly, far faster than anyone had anticipated for a first birth. Killian remained by her side, holding her hand, wiping her brow, whispering encouragement as she worked to bring their child into the world. "You're the strongest woman I know," he told her as she battled through another contraction. "You can do this, Florence. You're doing wonderfully." After what seemed both an eternity and an instant, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that immediately brought tears to Killian's eyes. Sarah efficiently handled the delivery while Elena prepared warm water and blankets. "A boy," Sarah announced, cleaning the infant before placing him in Florence's arms. "A perfect, healthy boy." Florence gazed down at the tiny red face, overwhelmed by the surge of love that washed through her. "Hello, James," she whispered, using the name they'd chosen if the baby was a boy after Killian's father. "Welcome to the world." Killian sat beside them on the bed, one arm around Florence, the other hand gently touching his son's cheek. "He's miraculous," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just like his mother." When Dr. Larson finally arrived the next morning, he found a peaceful scene, mother and baby sleeping soundly while the new father kept vigilant watch beside them. "Looks like you managed without me," the doctor observed after examining both Florence and James. "Everyone's in excellent health. You've got a strong wife and a strong son, Killian." "Don't I know it?" Killian agreed, pride evident in every word. News of James Forrester's birth spread quickly through Concordia. Visitors came bearing gifts and good wishes, admiring the handsome baby boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's blue eyes. "He'll be running the Double F someday," Killian predicted proudly as he showed his son off to Mr. Jenkins and other town businessmen who'd ridden out to congratulate the new parents. Florence recovered quickly from the birth, soon resuming her duties as mistress of the ranch, though now with a baby at her breast or sleeping nearby in the cradle Killian had crafted himself. James thrived, growing stronger and more alert with each passing day. As Christmas approached their first as a family, Florence found herself reflecting on the extraordinary year that had passed. One evening, after putting James to bed, she joined Killian in the parlor where he sat reading by the fire. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, noticing her thoughtful expression as she curled beside him on the sofa. "About last Christmas," she replied, "our wedding, and how much has changed in a year." He set aside his book, pulling her closer. "Good changes, I hope?" "The best," she assured him, resting her head against his shoulder. "A year ago, I never could have imagined being so happy, having such a full life. A husband I adore, a beautiful son, a home I love." Killian's arms tightened around her. "It's remarkable, isn't it? How the worst moments of our lives can lead to the best." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "If Wilson hadn't rejected you at that station, if you hadn't seen me crying," Florence continued. "If I hadn't offered my hand," Killian added. "Then none of this would exist," Florence concluded. "Our whole world would be different." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the crackle of the fire and the occasional soft sound from the nursery where their son slept. Outside, a light snow began to fall, dusting the ranch in pristine white. "I have something for you," Killian said after a while, reaching into his pocket. "An early Christmas gift." He handed her a small box tied with a simple ribbon. Inside, Florence found a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. "Open it," he encouraged. Inside were two tiny photographs, one of Killian, the other of baby James, both looking solemnly at the camera. "So we're always close to your heart," Killian explained, his voice soft. "Even when we're apart." Tears sprang to Florence's eyes as she fastened the locket around her neck. "It's perfect, thank you," Killian cupped her face gently, his gaze tender. "Thank you, Florence, for taking a chance on a dusty cowboy, for building a life with me, for our son, for everything." "I should be thanking you," she corrected, leaning into his touch. "You saved me that day at the station. In more ways than one." "We saved each other," he replied, drawing her into a kiss that spoke of devotion, passion, and the promise of many years to come. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the Double F ranch in silent beauty. Inside, by the warmth of the fire, Florence and Killian Forrester held each other close, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought them together and the love that had transformed both their lives. In the nursery nearby, little James slept peacefully, the first of what would eventually be 3 children to bless their home over the coming years. But that night, in the quiet intimacy of their parlor, Florence and Killian thought only of the present moment, of the miracle of finding each other against all odds, and of the extraordinary journey from heartbreak to happiness that had begun with tears at a train station and the simple, life-changing gesture of an outstretched hand. 10 years later, the Double F Ranch had grown into one of the most successful cattle operations in the region. The house had expanded along with the Forrester family, which now included 8-year-old James, 6-year-old Sarah Elizabeth, named for her aunt, and 3-year-old William. Killian and Florence's partnership had deepened with the years, each complementing the other's strengths as they built their life together. One spring afternoon, as the family prepared for Concordia's Founders' Day celebration, a letter arrived bearing a Boston postmark. Florence opened it with curiosity. It had been years since she'd received correspondence from her hometown. "What is it?" Killian asked, noticing her surprised expression as she read. "It's from my father's old law partner," Florence explained. "Apparently, some investments Papa made before his death have finally matured. There's quite a substantial sum." She looked up, her eyes wide. "They need me to come to Boston to sign the papers." Killian considered this news. "When would you need to go?" "Within the next month," she replied, still processing the information. "Then we'll all go," he decided promptly. "I've never seen Boston, and the children should see where their mother grew up." Florence's face lit with delight. "Really? You wouldn't mind leaving the ranch?" "Jackson can manage things for a few weeks," Killian said, referring to their foreman of 5 years. "Besides, I think it's time the East got a glimpse of what the West has made of Florence Kingston." 2 weeks later, the Forrester family boarded the eastbound train, the children buzzing with excitement about their first long journey. As the Kansas plains gave way to the rolling hills and eventual cities of the eastern states, Florence found herself growing increasingly nostalgic. "It seems like another lifetime," she commented to Killian as they watched the changing landscape. "When I rode this train in the opposite direction, I was so frightened, so uncertain." "And now?" he asked, his hand finding hers. She smiled, glancing at their children, James reading intently, Sarah Elizabeth sketching in her notebook, little William napping against his father's side. "Now I'm certain of everything that matters," she replied. Boston was a revelation, both familiar and strange to Florence after so many years away. The Forresters stayed in a fine hotel near the Common, and Florence took delight in showing her family the city of her youth. They visited the public garden, the Old North Church, and the harbor where tea had once been dumped in historic protest. The business with the lawyer was quickly concluded, revealing that Florence's father had made several prescient investments that had multiplied significantly over the years. The resulting inheritance would ensure the Forresters' financial security for generations to come. "What will we do with it?" Florence wondered as they discussed the unexpected windfall in their hotel suite. Killian considered the question seriously. "Some should be set aside for the children's education, perhaps some improvements to the ranch, and I've been thinking about that tract of land adjoining our west pasture." Florence smiled, loving his practical nature. "I'd like to establish something in Concordia," she suggested. "Perhaps a proper library, or a scholarship fund for promising students who can't afford further education." "Both excellent ideas," Killian agreed. "We can certainly do both." On their final evening in Boston, a surprising invitation arrived at their hotel from Albert Wilson. "How did he even know we were here?" Florence wondered, stunned by the elegant card requesting their presence at dinner the following evening. "Boston's still a small world in certain circles," Killian observed. "And I imagine your visit to your father's law firm didn't go unnoticed." Florence hesitated, the memory of that painful rejection at the station still holding some sting despite the years and happiness that had followed. "Should we accept?" Killian studied his wife's face. "That's entirely up to you, my love." but I admit to some curiosity about the man who was fool enough to walk away from the best thing that could have happened to him. In the end, curiosity won out. The following evening, they left the children with a hotel nanny service and made their way to Wilson's address, a handsome townhouse in one of Boston's better neighborhoods. Albert Wilson had aged considerably in the decade since Florence had last seen him. His hair had thinned, and a certain restlessness marked his movements as he welcomed them to his home. His wife, a nervous-looking woman some years his junior, seemed eager to please but uncomfortable in her role as hostess. "I must thank you for accepting my invitation," Wilson said as they were seated for dinner. "I wasn't sure you would." "Curiosity is a powerful motivator," Killian replied evenly, his hand resting protectively near Florence's on the table. Wilson nodded, seeming to understand. "I imagine you're wondering why I reached out after all this time." "The thought had crossed my mind," Florence acknowledged. "To apologize primarily," Wilson said, surprising them both with his directness. "What I did was unconscionable. I've regretted it for years." Florence studied the man who had once caused her such pain. "Why did you do it? The truth, please." Wilson sighed, glancing at his wife, who gave a small nod of encouragement. "I was in debt, substantial debt from bad investments. I needed money quickly and—" He trailed off, shame evident in his expression. "I advertised for brides, collecting train fare in advance with no intention of following through. It was deplorable." "Yes, it was," Killian agreed, his tone hard but controlled. "I've tried to make amends," Wilson continued. "I've repaid every woman I can locate. Some, like you, Florence, have proven difficult to find." He withdrew an envelope from his jacket. "This contains the train fare I took from you, with interest for the decade past. I know it doesn't erase what I did, but I hope it might help close that chapter." Florence regarded the envelope thoughtfully before accepting it. "Thank you for the gesture, Mr. Wilson. Though, as it happens, your rejection turned out to be the greatest blessing of my life." Wilson's eyes moved between Florence and Killian. "So I gathered from what I've heard. You've built quite a life in Kansas, it seems." "We have," Killian confirmed, his expression softening as he looked at his wife. "3 beautiful children, a successful ranch, and a community we're proud to be part of." The remainder of the dinner passed in surprisingly cordial conversation. Wilson's current business ventures seemed legitimate if not particularly inspired, and his wife gradually relaxed as the evening progressed. As they prepared to leave, Florence found herself alone with Wilson for a moment in the foyer while Killian helped Mrs. Wilson locate a book she'd mentioned during dinner. "I truly am sorry, Florence," Wilson said quietly, "and I'm glad to see how well things turned out for you." Florence regarded him thoughtfully. "Life has a way of leading us where we need to go, even when the path seems cruel at the time." "You've become quite the philosopher," Wilson observed with a sad smile. "I've become who I was meant to be," she corrected gently, "which would never have happened if I'd married you." On their return journey to Kansas, Florence found herself contemplating how profoundly her life had changed in 10 years. The frightened young woman who had stepped off the train at Concordia Station was almost unrecognizable to her now. "What are you thinking about?" Killian asked as they crossed the Missouri River, the western landscape beginning to emerge. "About how endings sometimes turn out to be beginnings in disguise," she replied, watching their children sleeping across from them. "If Wilson hadn't walked away that day, I would never have met you. Never had our children, never found my true home." Killian squeezed her hand. "I've thanked God every day for sending that fool Wilson walking in the opposite direction." Florence laughed softly. "As have I, though I never would have admitted it at the time." As the train carried them westward toward home, Florence felt a deep contentment settle over her. The inheritance would provide security and opportunities, but her true wealth lay in the family she and Killian had created together. The Double F Ranch came into view as they crested the final hill in their wagon, the house standing proud against the Kansas sky. Florence felt the familiar surge of love and pride at the sight of their home. "Welcome back," Killian said, noticing her expression. "Boston may be grand, but there's nothing like returning to your own place, is there?" "Nothing at all," Florence agreed, thinking of how far she'd come from that tearful day at the station. That evening, after the children were tucked into their beds, stories told and kisses given, Florence and Killian sat on their porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the vast Kansas sky. "You ever regret it?" Killian asked suddenly. "Not staying in Boston, trading that life for this one?" Florence turned to him, surprised by the question after all these years. "Never, not for a single moment." She took his hand, the same hand he'd offered her that fateful day at the station. "Everything I've ever truly wanted is here." Killian's smile was tender as he leaned forward to kiss her. "As is everything I never knew I needed, until a beautiful, tearful woman at a train station showed me what I'd been missing." Together they sat in the gathering darkness, the ranch quiet around them, their children sleeping safely inside, their future stretching out before them as vast and promising as the Kansas plains themselves. And Florence thought, not for the first time, how sometimes the most devastating moments in life can lead to the greatest joy if one is brave enough to place their hand in another's and take that first step into the unknown.